It is time to dive deep into Viktor Orban because he is the world's largest scam artist at this very moment, trying to persuade Hungarian citizens that having Ukraine in the EU is the worst thing possible on earth. And I'm tired of his bullshit, so let's break it down. Remember, he put a referendum together to try to convince his people that Ukraine is not a good idea to add to the EU, putting together a list of things of how it could hurt his country. And we're going to break that down, but there's one thing you need to understand here. He is so pro-Putin that I'm surprised they probably actually have bedtime phone calls every single night. As he said during the NATO summit, it's his job to make sure that Ukraine doesn't join the EU, which is why when he did his referendum, he randomly said that 95% of his country doesn't want Ukraine to join the EU, which I know is false because I've interviewed and saw so many reports of younger folks going out and voting against this dude and saying we want Ukraine to join. So let's break down the three main points that he puts here, which is financial risks, agricultural risks, and labor market risks. In it, he says Ukraine's EU membership would divert EU funds from Hungary and burden Hungarian households with hundreds of thousands of joint debt repayments. This is super misleading for two reasons. First point, the EU budget redistribution. Okay? First and foremost, anytime any new member comes into the EU, funds are always redistributed. There's never you guaranteed to get this money every single time. Every year the budget's different and it goes up and down depending what happens. So adjustments to this is super common, and it already happens now. Next, the quote-unquote joint debt. This is something that the EU has done many of times. But the big takeaway here is that Hungary would not uniquely bear the burden of Ukraine being added in. This would be shared proportionally across all of the countries. So the hit that Hungary would take is not a big hit. Next, him talking about hundreds of thousands per household is super inflated. That is not even something that's realistic. This is purposely driven up in order to really, politically make you vote a certain way. Next, he talks about agricultural, pretty much saying here that Ukraine's massive farmland will overwhelm the EU subsidies, hurting Hungarian farmers. This is a super large exaggeration, and it's lacking context. Because yes, Ukraine has 30 million hectares of usable or farmable land, but it's not 1/3 of the EU farmland like he's trying to make it out to be. Ukraine would add roughly about 25% of their farmable land into the EU system. Not 1/3, and it's not going to overwhelm the system since, I don't know if you realize this, Ukraine already distributes most of their stuff into Europe. And yes, okay, you want to make the argument that subsidies reform, it's going to cause such an issue with Hungary? No. Yes, there's going to be reforms, but it's not going to be killing farms. And if we look back in the past, let's look at Romania and Bulgaria. They had phased subsidies, which kind of lasted over 7 years. And these kind of reforms don't really stay around for a while. After X amount of years, they usually disappear. It's kind of how that works. But let's jump down now to the labor market risks, because it gets interesting here. He says that millions of Ukrainians will flood the EU labor markets, threatening local jobs with cheap labor. This is beyond highly misleading. First is, I don't know if you know this, for the past 3 years, millions of Ukrainians have already been working inside of Europe, and your government seems to be doing fine. And remember, being added into the EU doesn't mean that you automatically get free reign to go now work anywhere you want. There's a lot of steps in between in order to even get there. And because that takes typically 7 years, this guy's gonna be gone, which is something, speaking to you guys and interviewing you guys, you can't wait for. But lastly, I want to talk about cheap labor here, because for some reason, he thinks that Ukrainians are gonna come marching into Hungary, okay, and demand cheap labor jobs, which I don't know about you. Anytime I go for a job, I don't walk in the room and I go, you know what? What's the cheapest job you have here? I want that job now. What is interesting, though, is the fact that in Hungary, there actually is a surplus of jobs. The Ukrainians can actually fill those needed jobs, which would mean, in the end, you bringing Ukrainians into your country actually helps you out more. So let me leave you with this. The bottom line is, this guy here is using political theater in order to scare you into saying that, nope, Ukraine should not join because it's going to be horrible. When realistically, he's giving you the worst case scenarios as though like Ukrainians overthrew the government. But realistically, on paper, from the past, when new countries have been added, it only benefited the EU. Broadening the EU benefits every country. More economic integration, more security, and more stability. So for this guy, once again, to be very anti-Ukraine doesn't make any sense. It's the worst interest for Hungary for that to go through. And so my question for you, if you are in Hungary, how did you vote? Let me know. What do you think about Viktor Orban? And I'll be sure to keep you guys updated. Thank you for staying to the end. It's a long video, but there is a lot to break down here. I'll see you later.